morning, everyone. My name is Dowlat Norouzi. I represent the Iranian Resistance, the National Council of Resistance of Iran in the UK. I am very grateful to all of you for joining with us in today's program, and I will try my best to provide you with the most recent development, particularly concerned with the situation of human rights in Iran. As many of you may have heard, the Iranian ruling regime, the religious dictatorship, have been one of the most active violators of grave human rights situation in Iran. During the past 3 decades, ever since this regime came to power, some 120,000 of political and human rights activists, women activists, have been severely tortured and executed on political charges by this ruling regime. This regime, by misusing Islam and religion, justified the repression and gave itself the authority and the right to interfere in the most personal aspect of every individual's life and impose on them a sort of a military coup or actually repression against the totality of the public and the general public in Iran, particularly on women, as well as human rights activists, political activists. Under the so-called moderate Rouhani, things went much worse. During his tenure, some 2,300 were executed, which we know. These are some official figures, but the real number are much, much higher in reality. Particularly last year, Amnesty International reported that the wave of executions in Iran was shocking and unprecedented. The Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, Ahmad Shahid, said that the number of executions only last year, which totaled up to be 966, was the highest rate of executions in the past 2 decades around the world. Last week, the Iranian opposition movement, a delegation of it, was invited by members of the European Parliament at the Council of Human Rights in Strasbourg. During the Council's session, the delegation of the Iranian opposition movement was able to meet with many various officials, leaders, and vice presidents of different political groups, political parties, as well as different committees on the Council of Europe to discuss the situation of human rights in Iran and that what could be done about it and what should be the right policy as far as the European Union is concerned towards the Iranian regime and the Iranian people in general. So today we would be discussing that what are the areas of major concern in Iran and the effects of it in the Middle East region, and what Europe should do in terms of dealing properly with the Iranian regime, the crises that are emancipated from that regime, and particularly its policies of meddling into the affairs of regional countries, and also towards the Iranian people and the people in the Middle East. So thank you once again for being with us, and I'm very much ready for whatever questions that you would like to raise.
Thank you. Recently, you were involved in a campaign at the European Council in Strasbourg, where a lot of activities were going on to bring the issue to the attention of the representatives of Europe. Would you please tell us about the details of these activities?
Yes, I think it was so essential, particularly at the latest session of the Council of Europe, which is comprised of 47 different European countries, and its major mandate is actually improvement of human rights, democratic values, democratic institutions in various European countries, and also particularly the legal system and the courts, the legal measures in various European countries that need to be in line with international law and various international conventions that would secure and safeguard the fundamental rights of all individuals, and particularly a fair due process of law. And in this context, we did meet with various officials, the heads of the political groups, the vice presidents of those political groups, the largest one, the European People's Party, the Socialist Party, the Liberal Democratic Party, as well as the United Left. We met almost with all various political groups, as well as the head and the vice chairmen of different committees, particularly the political affairs and as well as the human rights, the legal affairs and human rights, and also the Committee on Non-Discrimination and Equal Opportunities. We met with the vice chairs and the chairs of these committees. We described and explained the situation of human rights in Iran, particularly wave of executions going on, and raised a lot of concerns, as well as providing them with documents. I have to say that vast majority of the members were very, very concerned. They strongly condemned the wave of executions in Iran. They called it that this is a systematic way that the ruling government has a sort of a machinery system that justifies the brutal and inhumane killing of the victims on their various charges. We described to them how many of these so-called attributed charges are as a result of forced confessions under the torture, and that this way the ruling religious dictatorship tries in international forums to justify and cover up the extent of atrocities they commit in Iran. And many of them, in terms of signing petitions, statements, making speeches, raised this huge concern and persuaded the leaders of the Council of Europe, the European Union, the United Nations Security Council, as well as the United States government, to take appropriate measures in order to immediately put a halt on these executions, and that they need to see a major change and progress in terms of human rights situation in Iran, particularly if there are any talks, negotiations, or trade and economic relations built up with this regime. It needs to be based and conditional on major improvement on the situation of human rights.
Yes, thanks. Recently, a few EU officials have visited Iran. Do you think this is helpful in improving the situation of human rights there?
Well, I have to say, unfortunately, the foundation of this whole regime is based on the velayat-e-faqih system, or the absolute rule for clergy. And during the past 3 decades, despite a lot of propaganda or rhetoric about some so-called moderate fighting or opposing the so-called radical, in reality, the Iranian people have only faced the repression by the Revolutionary Guard, which are the main repressive military apparatus of this regime throughout the country. The wave of executions continue unabated. The arbitrary arrests, torture, and hanging of the people, lashing them with cable wires, and some 74 methods of torture are used by that regime systematically. And so it is so clear that based on the realities, such trips are often, unfortunately, used by this regime in order to cover up the realities and in a way to legitimize their aggression and atrocities they commit against Iranian people, and in terms of crime they commit against humanity. It also, in a way, unfortunately, gives them a freer hand to continue such brutality and try to somehow justify what they do in Iran. So we have often said to leaders of the European Union that it's best for them not to give such excuse to the hands of Iranian regime. They need to be decisive. They need to have a firm policy to strongly condemn the atrocities and call upon the Iranian officials that if they would want to improve their relations with Europe, it must be conditional and based on a stop in executions and major development and progress in human rights situation in Iran. Unless that does not happen, having any thoughts that economic or trade relation may bring about a change or a positive effect on the system is an illusion.
Yes, thanks. Then what do you think is the best policy forward regarding Iran?
Well, as I mentioned, bearing in mind that there have been wave of executions in the past, some 120,000 political prisoners, and particularly the massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in only the summer of 1988. In addition, we have had 7 deadly attacks by mercenaries of this regime in Iraq against the Iranian opposition movement at Camp Ashraf and later at Camp Liberty, that resulted to some 165 deaths and a lot of devastation of the whole infrastructure of the camp and the properties of the residents, and many had been wounded. We think it is essential that the dossier of the crimes committed by this regime must be referred to the United Nations Security Council for actually implementing and acquiring measures, appropriate measures against this regime. Perhaps we think sanctions need to be imposed, more sanctions, and particularly the perpetrators of these crimes to face international court and to face justice, to be punished for the crimes they have committed against humanity for many years and decades. We're talking about a regime that some of its top officials, such as the Interior Minister, Mustafa Mohammadzadeh, have been responsible in carrying out death verdict and execution verdict against thousands of political prisoners. And these people can not be actually looked upon or taken as officials of a legitimate government. Definitely the totality of this regime does not represent the Iranian people, and their crimes is not in line with any international law and international norms, and they should face justice.
Yes. Then in your view, what are the real demands of the Iranian people from the officials of the European countries, the US and the United Nations?
Well, obviously, we think that in international community, there needs to be safeguards in order to ensure the citizens of all various countries, particularly now in Iran, that the West is on the side of millions of people in Iran that demand democracy, demand a major change of this regime, and demand basic human rights standards, which they really deserve. The main reason that the Iranian people went into uprising against Shah's dictatorship as a major revolution in 1979 was because of fulfilling their major aspiration to bring about human rights and democracy. And that aspiration still exists very much stronger than ever in the past. So I think the demand of the Iranian people and their expectation from the US as well as the European Union officials is that they would want to see the leaders of the world community standing on the side of millions for these very democratic values, and actually to isolating and very strongly pressuring the ruling religious dictatorship and demand a change. It is not only enough with words, we need action to be taken. And we just don't need the condemnation, but in addition, we need them to see actively implementing punishments and punitive actions against that regime to help with the aspiration of Iranian people for changing the system in Iran.
Yes, thanks. You pointed out some reports from Amnesty International about the deteriorating human rights situation in Iran, indicating that Iran is the biggest juvenile executioner. What would you like to say about that?
Well, as you know, according to the figures released, which, as I said, these are the official figures, only during Khatam Rouhani's tenure, there have been executions of 16 juveniles at least, where we know still 170 more are on the death row waiting for the execution. Some have been in prison for years now. It is very inhumane. They are psychologically tortured every day, humiliated. And the worst is that what is happening is that when this regime came to power, changed the whole legal system in Iran. And the whole judiciary is actually, the head of the judiciary is appointed by the supreme religious leader Khamenei, and the head of it now is Sadegh Larijani, which is responsible for executions of thousands of the Iranian youth and political and human rights activists. And definitely he needs to face international court. And according to their interpretation of Islam, many of these brutal, barbaric punishments are justified in the name of so-called Sharia law that are not in line with any international norms or standards. One of these brutal actions is that they consider both the age of marriage for the girl children to be 9 lunar years, which is actually 8 years, 8 months, and for the boys, 15 lunar years, which is 14 years, 8 months again. And that's very horrific to consider that those children could be both executed or forced marriage at such early ages, which actually ruins not only their childhood, but actually their rights as a human being and the foundation of any society. So the extent of devastation they created in the name of Islam and their brutal laws have enabled them to carry out all these terrors and all these atrocities, but in the world community they claim as if they are in line with the rule of law. And so the rule of law, as far as this regime is concerned, is barbarism and has nothing to do with any lawful action of a responsible representative government. So it is so essential that the world community understands that the judiciary system in Iran is not in line with international norms, not only because they do not allow the fair due process of law or for the victims to have the right for having a lawyer. These are the minimum. The totality of the whole legal and judicial system in Iran is out of the question. And it is the rule of jungle. It is interpretation of a very backwarded, fanatic, fundamentalist religious dictatorship that their only intention is to stay in power, and the way they do it by imposing terror and domestic repression that they try to justify in the name of so-called Islamic laws. There have been remarks by officials of that regime, they're very prominent figures that have acknowledged themselves. None of them have even gone to any high school, let alone talking about a lower school. And then they claim to be high judges or supreme judges of various so-called Islamic courts. So it is out of the question, and the totality of the judiciary system in Iran is, in my view, unlawful.
Yes. One of the friends has asked, could you please explain what can be done to help stop the execution in Iran?
Well, obviously, what they can do is, in our view, to get engaged in international campaigns. It is been very extensive effort by the leadership of Mrs. Mariam Rajavi, the president-elect of the Iranian opposition movement, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, that throughout the past decade, she has tried on many various fronts internationally as well as even within Iran to mobilize and organize various campaigns for defending human rights, women's rights, the children's rights in Iran, and particularly against the death verdict by the Iranian regime. As a result of it, lots of contacts with members of parliament in different parliaments or senates or the House of Commons or the Lords in various countries, or the US Congress and the Senate in the United States and around the world in various continents. Such campaigns have been led by the Iranian opposition movement as well as supporters, sympathizers of this movement. We would definitely encourage everyone joining with this movement, contacting their officials, contacting their foreign officers, their members of parliament, various human rights organizations, particularly on an international level, to persuade them for much stronger actions, not only in terms of disseminating information and giving reports on the extent of atrocities committed in Iran, but also trying to take actions, urgent actions to pressure the Iranian regime, impose sanctions, to find out about or make up the list of the violators of human rights and the henchmen of that regime. Their names, in my view, must be in the list of banned people, not only in terms of traveling outside Iran, but opening up any bank account around the world. Their assets must be frozen, and they must face international court for the crimes they commit. So all these are, in my view, parts of activities that anyone can kindly and effectively take part and participate, to be engaged and to hopefully defend the rights of Iranian people, particularly youth and children.
Yes, thanks. Do you think that your trip to Strasbourg was a success in raising the issue to the attention of the politicians?
Yes, I'm sure that we will see hopefully later on the fruits of this very valuable discussions we had with different political groups as well as the committees. They have committed themselves in various activities within the committees, and I am very much hoping that in a very near future we will have hearings on the human rights situation in Iran, as well as the situation of women and the very strong need for pressuring that regime to respect the rights of the fundamental rights of women on different fields and level. So I am sure that we will see many of these efforts to bear fruit in a very near future.
Yes, then what's the role of international community, especially what you recommend to do to Council of Europe or Parliamentary Assembly and EU?
Well, I think particularly at this stage, they can definitely call on the leaders of the world community to take various steps of implementing that international pressure against the regime. And of course, as I said, for instance, they can persuade various companies not to get engaged in trade and economic relationship, particularly long-term investment in Iran. because it is obvious that there is no political stability in that country, and when minimum standards of human rights are not respected, then there can't be any investment guarantee or actually job security for no one. So I think these are very materialistic advices and recommendations that they could give in order to prevent this regime being able to preserve its very brutal foundation and rule by trying to rely on international communities' legitimacy or trade and economic relationship. And so we advise them to strongly avoid any sorts of concessions provided to that regime, which would only help them to preserve their system for trying to stay in power a bit more and impose further domestic repression against the Iranian people, as well as export of terrorism and fundamentalism. You may be well aware that the atrocities they commit in Iran is very much in line with the kind of destruction that they export in the name of Islam to regional countries and neighbors, particularly to Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, Lebanon, and elsewhere. And it has created a huge crisis in the Middle East, which in our view is a vital part of the world community and definitely needs to be stopped.
Yes. Many in Western countries characterize that the current president in Iran is moderate and that there is a new beginning following nuclear deal with Tehran. What's your opinion?
I think Mrs. Mariam Rajavi, in her interviews with the Al Arabiya television network, set out very clear criteria to measure the true dedication of the claims that are made by some lobbies, in our view, or supporters of policy of appeasement towards the Iranian regime in general and particularly towards Rouhani. The benchmarks that she clarified was that we need to see actually in 5 major areas the true reality, whether this claim is a right claim in terms of Rouhani portraying himself as a so-called moderate. The first is really to see the full respect and commitment of that regime to human rights, which will include freedom of expression, freedom of association, freeing all political prisoners, and also the second would be that this regime tolerates giving the right to true, genuine opposition parties to have freedom of activities and to enable them to actively and freely operate within Iran. The third would be the commitment of that regime to international law and commitment, which will mean to stop meddling into the affairs of regional countries, particularly a halt on supporting and sponsoring international terrorism. And the fourth would be for that regime to stop its not only nuclear program, but also missile and production of weapons of mass destruction, which in all the area, I have to say that the regime's record and Rouhani's record has been worse than ever. And ever since he actually became the mullah's president, everything in terms of both human rights, the activities of the opposition movement, and in respect with all those areas, this regime has done much worse crime. And by far, you cannot in any way consider that such brutal face with a smiling, of course, mask could be recognized or designated as a moderate.
Yes, thank you. Anything else you want to tell us, Mrs. Norouzi?
Well, I am hoping that this conference was able to provide you with as much information, and our hope and actually our main request from all the viewers would be to actively participate in helping the Iranian opposition movement to convey its message, particularly to the leaders of the European Union. It's not time, in our view, for appeasing the Iranian regime or making such trips in giving an illusion that things have changed while they have not. And the people in Iran and the people in the Middle East understand all these realities quite well. I think it is more appropriate for all of them to demand the leaders in Europe to be much more responsible and to acquire policies which are in line with an ethical foreign policy, not a policy based on short-term economic interest. We know that this regime has been the most active supporter of the Syrian dictator Bashar Assad, which is committed a huge crime against his own people. It's a war crime, and the Iranian regime had spent millions and billions of dollars of purchasing weapons and transferring it to Bashar Assad, which is responsible for bombing and killing totally defenseless civilians in Syria. And then Europe is faced with flood of millions of refugees as a result of all these inhumane attacks and the meddling of Iranian regime, both in terms of military apparatus as well as financial aid to this very brutal dictatorship. So I think it is very wise for Europe to have a second thought on their relation with that regime, and that this regime is a huge part of the problem, not any part of the solution, and the right policy towards it must be their eviction from meddling into the affairs of regional countries, and an immediate need to stop executions and fundamental change in human rights situation in Iran. And I think that would enable the Iranian people inside to have much better chances and opportunity in order to join together in huge uprising, hoping to change that system for a free democratic republic in Iran, which has been also outlined in Mrs. Mariam Rajavi's 10-point charter of fundamental freedom. So we hopefully will see that this will come to happen.
Yes, thank you. I thank you for your sharing your thoughts with us, and for telling us about your recent activities in defending human rights in Iran.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this program. Thank you.
I thank you for joining us today and your contribution.